I'm going to turn the stage over to James and Mary Gage, and I'm going to go turn off that bank of lights up there so you can see a little bit better.
Good evening. Thanks for coming this evening. I hope you are coming away learning some of the things about Essex County and its history. Northeastern Massachusetts and southeastern New Hampshire have an abundance of historic and prehistoric stone structures. Space bar.
Space bar?
Or the Gage up. Gage up to get back.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Might you buy that?
Yeah.
No, I don't know.
Excuse me a moment as we navigate the technology over here.
Why did that big go forward? Or
You can just hit the space bar.
Okay.
So, some of the stone structures are familiar, like the stone walls, while others may have never heard of, like Native American stone cairns. And today's presentation is an introduction to the wide range of stone structures found in our region. And the next one. Some of the most commonly recognized stone structures in New England are the remains of old house and farm sites. Many of the local conservation lands in Essex County are old farmlands abandoned in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These farms were abandoned because the soil wore out, and they could no longer compete with the cheaper grains and vegetables being produced by farms out west. And many of the New England farmers opted to migrate west in search of better land. And all that remains of these abandoned farms are cellar holes, stone-lined wells, and miles of stone walls. Today, house cellars serve as a convenient place to store items, as a play space for children, or as a media or entertainment space. However, our ancestors thought about cellars quite differently. Building cellars were an important part of daily life from the 1600s through the early 1900s. Cellars were used for the storage and preservation of many food items. This was made possible by the fact that cellars remained cool in the summer and above freezing in the winter. So milk, cream, and butter were kept cool in the cellar, and various root crops like carrots, parsnips, turnips were stored in the house and barn cellars through the winter months because the cellar usually remained above freezing. Most building cellars prior to the late 1800s were built using stone without the use of mortar. This technique is called dry masonry. Mortar was expensive and was therefore really used prior to the late 1800s in the construction of the average house cellar. Only the wealthy could afford a foundation laid in mortar. House cellars come in three common layouts, which are illustrated in this slide. The rectangular cellar is a common type found in our area. The rectangular cellar is not always a good indicator of the original size of the house, because many times, especially prior to the 1800s, the cellar generally is only under half of the house. The other half of the house would have sat on low sill walls. The L-shaped, bracket-shaped layout that you see here in the middle and far right were designed to accommodate the central chimney block. These chimney blocks were usually 10 to 15 feet wide on the side and built generally into solid stone masonry. In some houses, the central chimney was supported by a lintel-type support system. And there are two basic versions of this type of chimney support. The one on the left has the stone lintel stones placed across the two support walls. And the example on the right would have used heavy wooden beams instead of stone for the lintels. And all that remains now are just the two upright support walls. The lintel on the left is from Tuckway State Park in Raymond, New Hampshire, and the one on the right is from Wendell, Massachusetts, which is out in western Mass. Most barn foundations are easily identified by the fact that they are three-sided foundations dug into a hillside. They were generally built with larger stones than house cellars because they needed to support more weight. To get a sense of the size of the boulders in the foundation, the black and white pole in the photo is 4 feet long. So you can get a sense of the massive size of some of these boulders that put in this foundation wall. The basement of the barn was used for a variety of purposes. Some farmers stored manure in them to be spread on the field during the spring. Others used it to shelter sheep and cows. And by the 1800s, many barns had a room partitioned off towards the back wall, which was used to store root crops to be fed to livestock during the winter. Root crops improved milk production of cows, and they also increased the live birth rate of sheep, so it would help improve the bottom line of any farming operation. And prior to the introduction of the modern public water supply system, most homes and farms dug a well to supply water for the household. The wells were circular stone-lined shafts sunk into the ground from 6 to 25 feet deep. The well photo we just had up there, that well's almost 30 feet deep. It's in downtown New London, Connecticut, and it's still quite operational. It's on a historic house, and it's kept in good condition. It's one of the deeper wells you find on historic sites. Most of the sites we see around the area is from 6 to maybe 15 feet deep. Yes?
How did they get the water out?
The water is brought up in buckets most of the time, and there are several different ways you can bring the bucket up.
But it was a bucket, they didn't.
Right, the bucket's on a row, and you know, the sort of iconic well house you see with the little hand crank. That was one way to do it. A little time consuming because you got to crank the rope up. A faster way was to really long pole or pivot point and attach the bucket and the rope to one end and then just pull the end of the pole up. It's called a well sweep, and bring the bucket right up. A few of your wealthier houses by the late 1700s, early 1800s actually were installing wooden pump systems, hand crank pumps in the houses. But those are fairly rare. We actually recently saw one down in the Garden of Pembrey house down in Salem, Massachusetts. They actually were able to afford to have an actual hand crank pump right in the kitchen. But those are really rare. Most people are unfortunately stuck with using the buckets to bring water up.
Do we know what kind of piping they would use to bring to the pump?
As far as I know, most of the early piping was originally wood. Even some of your early public water supply systems, they went in places like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, were wooden pipes where they had a long drill that they drilled out the corner, and they just put them end to end. And mostly a gravity feed system at the time. Galvanized piping, which is used actually still to this day for a lot of private rural wells, comes into the late 1800s, early 20th century. We actually, on some houses, on farm sites that were lived on into the early 20th century, we actually see some of the old stone line wells being retrofitted with galvanized pipe and electric pumps on the land, so that the seashells were supposed to be for the benefit of the residents of the town, and they weren't supposed to be getting rich off of it. So a lot of towns passed laws saying you can only cart off so many cartloads per year, and you had to use it on your farm. You couldn't sell it to somebody in another town.
Well, since technology seems to have failed us, to move this forward and move closer.
Yeah.
Yes, let's go.
Yes, let's do it.
What about those birds?
Maybe close the chairs in, have some
spaces.
I don't think,
So we're
I don't
moving
think
space, yeah.
Vision and NAHS got RCA.
Right, we have to go to that. We have to go to
I know, I know.
I've never used this before.
I mean, it just, that other.
Everybody see that?
You know what the,
I like those.
cardboard box.
Yeah, they have one, they have the,
I thought I'd make sure.
Need a hand? I can get it.
yeah, you use that.
You can move the chairs if you want.
If we lift it up a little, would that be helpful for people to see?
Give it a try, see what they can.
And this will be a nice one. I was looking at the computer on Monday then. It comes back to life. See this guy, I would have.
Down towards our heads a little bit.
Because Jessica's done that, we need to get.
There we go.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, we're back on rails. All right, we're gonna resume with our makeshift solution here. One of the things you need to, if any of you guys go exploring old farm sites, one thing we always tell people when you're poking around the old foundation, first thing you do is locate the old well. And this is the reason why. Most of the wells you'll find have been properly backfilled with stones. But once in a while, somebody thinks they're way back, 100 years ago, so it would be smart just to put a bunch of old bullets over it. And now we're dealing with a situation like this one is from Connecticut, where the bullets are rotting out, and there's a lot of brush over it, and there's a risk of somebody actually stepping on and going down into the well. So I always recommend people find the well first and then poke around the site, just so for your own personal safety. The question I get a lot is how the heck did they actually dig these wells? And there's actually a fairly simple solution to this. The first step is to dig an upside down cone-shaped hole in the ground until you reach the water table or underground stream. And the purpose of the cone-shaped hole was to prevent the walls of the excavation from collapsing. The second step was to start building the circular stone-lined shaft from the bottom up. And the bottom section of the well needed to be built without any mortar to allow the water to seep through the stonework into the well. And as the stone-lined shaft went upward, space outside the shaft was backfilled. And the third step was to bring the shaft to the ground level and erect some sort of structure on top for, winching up the bucket and making sure people don't fall in. And some of the farmers had what they call a stone well cap with a center hole in it placed over the top of the well. The well caps can be made from a single slab of stone or from two slabs. The two-piece example is from Governor's Island in Hampstead, New Hampshire, and dates to the late 1700s. The single-piece example is from New Hampton, New Hampshire, and dates from the mid-1800s. And the general idea of the well cap was to create a smaller hole for the bucket to go through so people and children could get up on the well safely and reduce the risk of falling in. And it also helps keep any contamination out of the well. Stone walls have become an iconic part of the New England farm landscape. However, stone walls did not become popular with New England farmers until around the time of the American Revolution. Prior to the mid-1700s, wood fencing was extensively used due to the readily available supply of trees. But as the forests were cleared, wooden rails became more expensive. So farmers turned to another resource they had in abundance, stone. Stone walls had several purposes. They worked well as fencing to keep livestock in or out of a field. They were used to mark property boundaries. And they were used to divide farm fields into different sections. They also proved useful as a place to get rid of some of the stone plowed up in the fields. The most common type of stone wall is the throne wall. This type of wall is a single stone wide, and they look like they were thrown together. But despite their appearance, they were generally carefully built. And this type of wall was widely used on farms in New England. The more affluent farms and the wealthy estate owners could actually afford a better quality wall. And estate walls were generally carefully built with flat faces, which gave them a finished look. This example is from Mosley State Park. The Mosley Estate, that is now a state park over in Newburyport. You can actually go around and walk around and see some of this stonework. Wide stone walls range from 6 to 15 feet wide and can be a bit puzzling the first time you encounter one in the middle of the woods. Most of these wide walls are found on old but abandoned farms. The farmers called them disposal walls. The farmers built 2 parallel stone walls, and then they dumped the stone plowed up in the field between the 2 walls. And what you get is this massive, like this example here, walls that just filled with thousands of rocks. And these weren't built in a single year. They were accumulated over many years of plowing. There's a long-standing folk tradition that New England roads were terrible and that the average farmer never traveled more than 20 miles from home. And there's some truth to this story, but it's largely a myth. The colonial towns of Massachusetts were connected together by a series of major roads. These roads had a number of inns and taverns that served travelers. The travelers included government officials going to a session of the legislature, post riders carrying the mail, farmers moving livestock and produce to markets in nearby towns. And this 1814 map shows some of the major roads in northeastern Massachusetts. Obviously, it shows it better up when it's blowing up. There's a series of roads connecting so many major towns together, long ways out of Boston, heading up into New Hampshire and Portsmouth. The mileage between the towns had been measured by the late 1600s and was generally well known. And beginning in the early 1700s, the first milestone marking these distances between towns began to be erected. Essex County has a number of surviving milestones marking the mileage along the Old Bay Path from Boston to Portsmouth. Examples can be found in Wenham, Ipswich, and Newbury. This 1708 milestone is on the grounds of the Governor's Dummer Academy in Newbury. It is the oldest surviving milestone in the United States. It was carved by Jonathan Hartshorn, a local gravestone carver. It features bold letters, mileage separated by lines, and a double triangle symbol on the bottom. Two years later, 3 milestones were erected in Wenham. They copied the style of having the mileage separated by lines by using small and more conservative lettering. The mileage in the milestone in the center marked a half-mile point. It's a little hard to see on the small screen, but it's I believe 20.5 miles.
Yes.
This is half-mile marks are very unusual. Most of the milestones you'll ever find are all whole number of miles, 1, 2, 3. And the milestone on the right-hand side of the screen has the initial DD at the very bottom. And these are the initials of the gentleman that commissioned the milestone to be carved. And with some genealogical sleuthing, Mary was able to actually figure out who D.D. was. His name was Daniel Dodge. He lived in Wenham. So sometimes there's still some mysteries to be solved out there, a little bit of detective work. In the 1730s, 3 more milestones were carved in Newbury, this time by members of the Mulligan family, who were also local gravestone carvers. The Mulligans continued the tradition of bold lettering and decorative folk art found on the 1708 milestone. However, they abandoned the use of mileage separated by lines which had gone out of fashion. These milestones are still in place on the roads in Newbury, and we actually have on our website a little tour map that you can download and print, and you can go view them. The section of Route 1 between Newburyport and Boston started out as the Newburyport Turnpike. It was opened in 1806. And it had plain granite milestones erected, a number of which have actually survived in the towns of Raleigh and Topsfield. They were erected sometime between 1806 and 1809, and a number of them are still marked along Route 1. You can stop and view them. I do recommend find some place safe to park. They travel a bit fast up there. We're going to move on to historic stone quarrying. In New England, you'll find several different types of stone quarries. The simplest type is the boulder quarry. As the name implies, boulders were split apart into blocks and slabs suitable for constructing foundations, stone walls, and similar projects. Most boulder quarries are found on old abandoned farms. They were worked by the farmer generally in the off-season to supply stone for projects on the farm or to sell in the local market to generate some additional cash for the farm family. There were several ways to quarry a boulder. You could drill a single deep hole in the middle of the boulder, fill the hole with black powder, and then blow it up. Blasting was rather unpredictable, both from a safety standpoint of view and just from a perspective of quarrying. One of the problems with blasting is it's very difficult to predict where the boulder is going to break apart. So it's sort of a roll of the dice if you got something that's actually usable. A better approach was to split the boulder in half, split each half into quarter sections. This would give pieces of stone with several usable flat sides for building foundations and walls. Although this method created several usable flat sides, you usually end up with at least one rounded side, which made it more difficult to work with. So our Yankee ancestors finding a problem they wanted to solve, came up with a solution. In the 1830s, a new, more practical approach was developed for quarrying boulders. Boulders were carefully split into layers and then subdivided into blocks and slabs. This method produced stone slabs that were truly rectangular, with all the sides being flat. As this illustration shows, there was an actual specific sequence you need to follow to take the boulder apart. Obviously, it works better when it's blown up. But essentially, what they were doing is trimming off some of the rounded portions of the boulders that start a flat side, and then cutting the boulder in a series of layers, and then going vertically up and down. And therefore, you came up with these nice long blocks that work great for foundations. And you can actually find examples of this technique. This particular one we just found over this past winter, it's over in Lockport, Mass. It's a fairly small boulder, probably about this big, and they were splitting it vertically into a series of short blocks. And it got abandoned partway through the process for whatever reason, and so it's left there for us to be able to actually observe the very process of taking it apart. Another type of quarry was a surface ledge quarry. These quarries took advantage of the natural tendency of granite to form in layers. The quarryman can split the stone one layer at a time, similar to how you peel an onion. Surface ledge quarries generally only remove the top of 2 to 3 layers of stone. In many of these ledge quarries we find here in northeastern Massachusetts were small commercial operations. The one shown in this photo was actually opened up specifically to provide stone slabs for building culverts along a railroad line. It's up in Sandown, New Hampshire. And it's maybe 200 feet away from the railroad bed. Beginning in the late 1820s, we began to see large-scale commercial quarries open up. These quarries sought the better quality building stone which could be found deeper in the bedrock. These deep pit quarries were made possible by the invention of the quarry derrick around 1825. The derrick allowed large blocks to be lifted out of the quarry and then swung around to the side of the quarry and dropped into a wagon or later on a train car. And with this huge technological leap in hoisting technology revolutionized the New England quarry industry and made commercial quarrying a viable and commercially profitable business. Any deep pit quarries you'll run across, whether it's out in Cape Ann or up in New Hampshire or Vermont, they're all going to date from 1825 or later. Several different methods were used to split the stone apart in the quarries. And each method leads to a different type of tool mark on the rock. And we're going to see a number of these tool marks this Saturday in our tour over at the Jenkins Quarry. And this is a photo we took over there recently when we were scouting out the tour. The most common tool marks you'll find on quarried stone are a series of half-round holes spaced 6 inches apart along the length of the stone. The holes were drilled with something known as a plug drill, and we have an example on the back table we'll look at afterwards. Once the holes were drilled, the quarryman would place 2 half-round shims called feathers into each hole. A wedge would be inserted between them. The quarryman would then take a small sledgehammer and tap each of the wedges, one after another, right down the line. And he'd keep repeating this until he heard a cracking noise. And then they'd take a crowbar and pop the 2 pieces of rock apart. The technique is really one of finesse rather than brute strength. The idea is not to slam the wedges in really hard, but to tap them firmly and continue to do it several times until you get the rock to split apart. Another type of tool mark you might find are these unusual elongated slots that form a dashed line across the rock. And that's the photo on the left side of the screen. When these quarry holes are split in half, you find that it looks like a trapezoid mark. Now, these unusual marks in the rock were cut with a tool called a Cape chisel. We also have an example of that in the back. And the rock was split apart using a similar system to the previous method, but the shims and the wedges were flat instead of round, squat.
excuse me, and thin. And like the previous methods, they tap each of the wedges in sequence and continue to do that until the rock cracked. And then they would pull it apart.
I have a question.
Yes?
Like around what years or what time period was this method used? Are there any implications once you see this type of mark on a rock, and could you say to yourself, this happened between this range of time?
Yep, that's, next slide.
Oh.
It's a very common question we get, and it's a very useful one for when you're dealing with dating and historic structures. Place here. In terms of dating, tool marks are useful to a certain degree. So yes, you can use them to date, but some of the date ranges are a little bit broad, so they're not as useful as we'd like them to be. But having qualified that, I'll tell you what we do know about dating. The plug and feather method that used the round holes spaced every 6 inches apart was developed in 1803. Specifically, the technique of spacing the holes 6 inches apart. There are an earlier version of the technique that dates back about 20 years, but it's fairly rare, and most people don't encounter it. And the plug and feather method with these holes, round holes spaced every 6 inches apart, was developed in 1803, spread very rapidly through the Quincy quarries and then outward through east Massachusetts into New Hampshire, and by the 18 teens was fairly being used in a widespread area. And it was used into the early 20th century, and it actually continues to be used today. We talk to stonemasons who are doing historic preservation work, restoring houses and historic properties, and they still use the original hand technique to cut replacement rocks. Some of your other stonemasons that are working on doing landscaping for people will cheat a little, they'll get their big power pneumatic drills out and drill the holes, but the technique really remains pretty much the same. The flat wedge, which is those trapezoid holes I showed you, that technique was also invented in 1803. And it was used quite extensively through the early 1800s. We don't see, it seems to disappear from your average farm site, and then you'll start seeing it show up in road construction. There are earlier blast holes prior to 1800. They're exceptionally rare, and they're generally they have smaller diameter and much shorter. And if somebody wants to know more about that, send me afterwards. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But if you find a boulder up in the middle of the woods, it's got a blast hole in the center of the boulder, there's a really good chance that it dates from sometime in the 1800s. I have a question for everybody in the audience. How many people know that there was a silver rush in Essex County? Anybody ever heard of silver mines in Essex County? Now, in the early 1870s, silver was discovered in Newbury by a local farmer who was an amateur geologist. And the farmer purchased the field where he found it for $350. A few months later, he sold the same field to 3 local businessmen for $100,000. And I went online and did the calculations, and that's $100,000 is about $2 million today. In the fall of 1874, the businessmen hired some miners and began blasting a mining shaft. And this mine would become the famous Chipman Silver Mine. 6 months later, this group of businessmen sold the mine to a group of New York investors for $1 million. It works out to $20 million today. And with the opening of this, the Chipman mine, real estate speculators, miners, and investors, newspaper reporters, they all just descended on Newbury and the next door neighbor in Newburyport, and started a rather short-lived silver rush that lasted about 3 years. And during this time, it's estimated approximately 25 mining shafts were sunk in the Newbury, Amesbury, Raleigh, and Georgetown area. And hundreds of test pits and trenches were dug by property owners with dreams of getting rich. But only a few mines ever proved profitable. It turns out the real winners in the Newbury Silver Rush were the farmers who sold their old worn-out rocky pastures for fabulous sums of money. And there are still a few mining shafts left over there. Most of them have been backfilled. This is one of the rare ones that has not been backfilled. It's on private property. And we don't know how deep it is. Fortunately, the records haven't survived. But it gives you a sense of what these things will look like when they were operational. Of course, they would have had a shaft house over to lower them in and out. We're going to move on to another subject. This is the topic we were alluded to in the beginning about stuff you may not be more as familiar with. The Native Americans, over the past 3,000 years, have had a tradition of building stone structures for spiritual and ceremonial purposes. These stone structures include stone cairns, stone stones, and stone chambers. Examples of all of these can be found in our region. In the 1700s, several Christian missionaries traveled to various Native American villages as part of their efforts to encourage conversion to the Christian faith. And many of them employed Native American guides. And on several occasions, they recorded in their letters and diaries that their Native American guide would stop along the trail at a large stone pile, offer a silent prayer, and then place a stone on the pile. When asked why they did this, they simply replied it was an ancient tribal custom going back many generations. In 1762, Reverend Ezra Stiles drew the sketch of a large stone cairn in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Reverend Stiles measured the cairn as being 18 feet long and 6 feet high. This cairn contained thousands of stones accumulated one stone at a time by passing Native Americans. Today, researchers call these rock piles stone cairns. So we have historical documentation that the Native Americans built stone cairns. We also know that New England farmers sometimes discarded stones removed from the fields in piles as well. And to distinguish them, we call the piles created by the farmers field clearing piles. But how do you distinguish out in the field between a Native American cairn and a field clearing pile? Well, field clearing piles are usually found along the edges of old farm fields. And occasionally the farmer would pile them in the middle of the field on exposed bedrock or some unusable piece of land in the field. But one thing the farmers did not do is they did not leave these piles scattered all over their fields. It would make plowing very difficult because you have to weave in and out of all the piles. So they, as a general rule, would pick the piles up and drop them at the edge of the fields, get them out of the way of the plow. And they found us would move the stones on the field either in the back of a wagon, or a little two-wheel dump car, or a toboggan-like sled, they call a stone sled, or stone boat. And when they got the rocks to the edge of the field, they sort of unceremoniously just dumped them out of the back of the wagon or rolled them off the stone boat. And the result is when you dump anything, is you tend to get a lot of stones scattered around the edges. So field clearing piles tend to be not terribly neat. There's a lot of stones scattered around the edges. In contrast, the Native American stone cairns were carefully built, and they show most of the time decent structure. There's no rocks scattered around them, so there's a visual difference in construction between the two. There are three basic types of Native American stone cairns. The first are cairns built on the ground. Most ground cairns are oval or round shaped stone mounds. They range in size from 3 feet wide up to around 25 feet or more. They can be low to the ground, or they can be really high. This photo is of a medium-sized cairn with a fairly high mound. The black and white pole in the photo is about 4 feet high, to give you a sense of scale. These large community cairns are called by researchers community cairns, mostly because these cairns were created over time through members of the Native American community putting stones, individual people putting stones on it at the particular ceremony or ritual that was occurring. So it's a place where the community gathered for ceremony. This particular cairn is part of a large group, about 25 to 30 cairns clustered together. And that's another particular trait of Native American cairns. They tend to come in really tight groups or clusters. You'll get 25, 30 of them or more in a half acre. Obviously, they're not field clearings. It's trying to drive the plows through cairns every 5 to 10 feet would just be an enormous amount of work. Most of the stone cairns are ceremonial. And one of the reasons we know this is from an excavation that took place in 1983. James Barbour and Byron Dix excavated a stone cairn on the ground in Freetown, Massachusetts. The cairn was threatened with destruction. They wanted to bulldoze the site for the industrial park. So they went ahead and did an excavation, hoping to be able to establish the origins of the cairn and its purpose. The excavation uncovered 2 small charcoal deposits, which were C14 dated to 1075 AD and the other to 1160 AD. So this thing's about 900,000 years old. They also found 120 pieces of red ochre. The red ochre is a substance that is considered sacred by the Native Americans and is well known to have been used as a ceremonial object. So they were able to establish through this one excavation that some of the cairns out there are indeed Native American, that this tradition of building cairns goes back at least 1,000 years, and really certainly goes back even further. But most stone cairns that have been excavated usually do not have such spectacular results. And the Native American tribes have actually asked researchers and archaeologists not to take them apart, because they still consider some of these places to be sacred tribal sites, and they don't have a problem with people visiting. They just ask people respect, don't dig into the cairns, don't add rocks to them or vandalize them. But people are quite welcome to wander around, take photographs, and visit them. The second type of cairn that we find are cairns that are built in boulders. And the choice to build a cairn on top of the boulder was intentional on the part of the Native Americans. They attached some sort of spiritual or symbolic significance to it. Unfortunately, we don't know what that is. And cairns built in boulders come in a wide range of designs. And this is an example of one with just a few stones on top. This is another common type of cairn built on a boulder. In this case, the stones cover the entire top of the boulder. And I'm not sure if you can see it in here, but there's right about here, there's a little card in there with some numbers on it. And what that is a identification card that we use when we go out to document some of these sites. We assign each of these cairns a number, and we put this card in the photo so that we can match up our field notes to the photographs. Then we go out and take basic measurements. Sometimes it's a drawing of it for documentation purposes. Any question on that?
Are those boulders attached in any way to the large boulder, or are they loose?
They're loose.
Okay.
And there's a third type of cairn that we find. We call them split boulder cairns. These are boulders that have been split apart, usually vertically, and the space in the split in the boulder has been filled with small stones. And this particular example is over at Dogtown in Gloucester, Mass. You can actually go see it. And what we know from the research we've done so far, these splits in the boulders were considered to be doorways or portals to the underworld, the world underground. In the Native American religious tradition, the underworld was a place where there were powerful spirits. And they would make ritual offerings to these spirits for various reasons, to attain spiritual power, praise for healing, praise for safe journey, and so forth. And for the Native Americans, the small stones were the offering. Other cultures today use different things, holy water and so forth. For the Native Americans, stone was their sacred object. A few Native American sites, the Native Americans set up alignments to the summer solstice, winter solstice, and spring and fall equinoxes. The best known of these alignment sites is at America Stonehenge up in North Salem, New Hampshire. The site is actually open to the public for an admission fee. It's certainly worth checking it out. It's really neat site. Now, the standing stone in this photo, which is in the center towards the back, it's maybe a little hard to see. It's a flat stone, goes vertically up, and on one side it's got a long slant on it. And in the foreground, which is again probably a little hard to see on the computer, there's a round boulder in the ground. And on the boulder, there's a groove that's been carved into the rock. And my mother Mary went up there and on the summer solstice sunrise and realized that the alignment for this particular standing stone can be viewed from that boulder with the groove. It's a perfect place to witness the alignment. What occurred here was this was being used as a ritual site. Was a shaman or a medicine person would sit or stand in front of this groove in the rock, and they poured a little bit of water as a sacred offering just before sunrise. And then the sun would come up over the stone. We've got a sequence of photos showing her. You can see the standing stones outlined over the sunlight. And the sun just starts to come over the very bottom corner of the slant. And then, full-fledged, that's it. It works, still works beautifully. And it's an amazing experience to go up and see this. Sunrises, they do open it up for the various alignments up there. Sunrise is generally less crowded. When we were up and we got these photos, it was like 3 people there, so everybody could see it. Probably the most spectacular stuff that gets everybody excited in Native American stone structure research are stone chambers. And it's estimated that there are over 400 stone chambers in the greater New England area. We don't have an exact count yet because we keep finding new ones. But this particular one is up in Newton, New Hampshire. It was an excavation done back in the 1960s, and it was 14 days, about 800 years ago. It was the carbon was some charcoal flown on the top of the roof stone, so it was deposited after the chamber was built, so it's a really solid date. Unfortunately, the rear wall of this chamber is collapsed. That's those stones you're seeing in the back. And it's on private property, and unfortunately, I haven't been able to get the property owner to agree to allowing it to be repaired. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to get that fixed. This is another stone chamber. It's out in Shutesbury, Massachusetts, out west of Mass. It's unlike the chamber we just saw. It's actually a round, well-like shaft that drops down about 4 or 5 feet. This is the entrance to it. It's quite small, but you can fit in. You can get maybe 2 people inside. It has a single large sort of round capstone on the top. And there's actually 3 chambers in this area built in this style. Why it was built around, we don't know, but it's a style really unique to the Shutesbury area. I have not found or heard of any others outside of it. And this particular chamber is, I'll get you in a second, is in Burlington, Massachusetts. It's right in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. It's on a historic property, and historic society owns properties. Done an excellent job of preserving it. It's got the front's got a small entrance, maybe about 2 feet high. You have to get on your hands and knees to crawl inside. Short passageway, and then it opens up to a fairly large square rectangular room inside. You can get several people in there. The roof of it is this huge, long stone slab, which you can just barely see in that photo on the upper right corner, which is showing the back side. And this is just to show you that even in the middle of the suburban neighborhood, some historic and prehistoric structures have survived. And you can find them just about any place. You had a question?
Do you think that round stone chamber that you said was about 4 or 5 feet deep might be used for a sacrifice?
There is no evidence that there's any type of animal sacrifice or anything else here in New England.
Okay.
I mean, there are some people that have suggested it, but in all of the reading I've done in the past 20 years on Native American cultures here in New England, there's not a single reference to any type of sacrifice. They were far more into making offerings, stone, tobacco, water, clothing, tools, beads, that sort of items, the type of items that we find that they were leaving as offerings to spirits.
If I could just say for a moment, this is part of my research. Out in the Great Lakes, we have one story of a vision quest, and the man went into a chasm where he went inside, split rock like here.
Okay.
And what he did was he went into the underworld. It's dark, it's cool, it's damp, and he gives this whole story on his vision. Your chambers are like caves. They're dark, they're damp, they're cool, and in my estimation, you're going into the underworld. These chambers are set up. There were probably only shamans that used them in the specialty that could deal with the certain spirits that go
Sort of like a temple.
Something, yeah, but it would be the priest of the shaman
Right.
is the priest of power of their culture, and they'd be the only ones that, unlike the common community, would come to a cairn.
Walking through a historic district or go out on the conservation land, your eyes will be open to looking for things you may not have noticed before. As an example, this photograph's actually from over in Harrow Park State Park. It's in a granite quarry. It's fairly close to the Jenkins soapstone quarry, but most people aren't even aware of it. The trail walks through it. But once you realize, you got some familiarity with the quarry tool marks and stuff, you'll start seeing quarry boulders, blasted boulders, all over the place here in New England. I appreciate everybody coming out tonight, and apologize for technological snafus, but I think we've managed pretty well. On our table, we have some of the quarrying tools that are actually antiques, mostly from the 1800s. There's also a couple of rocks that I brought from one of the Newbury mining sites. It actually has some of the ore in it. We know they're called them silver mines. They were actually technically, as far as the geology is concerned, called lead silver mines, because over 90% of the ore was lead, as in lead piping. And only 2% of the ore was actually silver. One of the pieces, if you hold it up to the light, you'll see a little bit of sparkliness in it. That's the flakes of silver. And the black that's in the rock is the lead. Questions?
I built some stone wall, but every time I look at a rock, I think about moving it and how much it's going to weigh. Do you have any ground figure for the density of the rock?
The rough number that gets used here in New England is between 125 and 150 pounds per cubic foot. So if you get a 1 foot roller and make a cube on it, that's probably about 150 pounds of granite. So if you measure a boulder, you do height, length, and width,
That's going to make them harder to move than they were.
The stonemasons I've had the opportunity to talk with tell me it's all about leverage. Get
Things like
crowbars and a proper fulcrum, and you can move lots of things. And you don't have to move the whole thing at once. Sometimes they'll put it on one end and they'll just rotate one end and they'll just keep working it back until they get it where they want. Or the other option is to put it on a piece of heavy plywood, roll it on that and drag the plywood over. There are ways of moving stuff without killing you back.
get it back all
I was just curious if you'd ever tried splitting granite with the feather and chisel method or anything like that.
I've seen it demonstrated, but I haven't actually tried it myself. And we've had an opportunity to talk with a number of stonemasons to say it works very well. And we've actually seen a few demonstrations of that.
Out to Gloucester, Gloucester, is it?
Rockport.
Rockport, the state park out there.
Elephant Point State Park.
In the summertime, they have some demonstrations of the park rangers. I don't know exactly when but you can It's a great place to go see. There's a lot of examples out there, and they have some live demonstrations, and you just have to check and find out when they're taking place if you're curious.
You can find that information online at NAHS.gov/PCR.
It's an old, it's a late 1800s quarry, it's a big, massive deep pit quarry. They have a self-guided trail around the quarry with all sorts of different tool marks and types of things that are made from the quarries. And it's a really a marvelous place to visit. And they also run some programs here. You just have to call and get the schedule.
Do you have any history for us of the soapstone?
Yes, I'm going to cover that on the tour.
Saturday.
That's fine. It was open. I can tell you, it was started around 1835 by William Jenkins, Addison Flint, and Michael Flanelli. The three businessmen that opened it up. I've actually been going through the historic records the past few weeks trying to track down some history on it because it's not a lot has survived. The original contracts between the three gentlemen have survived, and actually here the art there's a transcription of my got from the archives here. And I've also been digging through some old online newspaper databases and found a few period newspapers talking about the quarry being opened up. And so it's easier to go over some of the history on site, so I can show you what the different buildings were and what was actually going on.
What about the use of it? The only thing I recall is when I used my hot water bottle, when the time to keep my feet warm. My parents had a soapstone, and heated up in the oven with a wire handle, and you put it in the bed.
Yeah. So the question is what soapstone was used for. One of the common things that everybody's familiar with is those thin blocks with a wire handles that they heat up and put in the beds as bed warmers. Another major thing that they were used for is building kitchen sinks, those big farmer sinks that you now see as landscaping features in people's yards. They're also used for a limited amount as gravestones. They're actually, hopefully we'll try and track a few down this weekend. I'm told that there are two cemeteries over in Andover that actually have soapstone gravestones made from the Jenkins quarry. They're also using it to a limited degree for architectural stonework, for building facades, and possibly for some fountain bases. That's the uses I know about. Probably more others.
This is susceptible to acid rain kind of thing.
One of the great things about soapstone is it doesn't react much. It holds heat well, and there's actually a company out from Vermont that actually makes wood stoves out of soapstone, because even when the fire dies, it continues to radiate heat for hours. People like them for countertops in their households because they are not reactive to household cleaners, not like granite, which tends to porous, and you have to keep resealing every 6 months to a year. Soapstone is very dense, and it won't clog up with oils and other stuff, so it cleans up very easily. And soapstone, when it first comes out of the quarry, is very easy to carve, but as it dries out, it tends to get harder. So a lot of the work had to be done really quickly after it came out of the quarry. The Native Americans actually took advantage of that fact. They used to make bowls from it. They'd take a knob, they'd quarry off a knob on the rock, break it off, and then they would hollow it out. And after a while, it would harden up, and then they could use it for cooking and hot foods without having any risk of cracking or breaking on them. Yes?
What about small granite pieces for keeping carriage feet warm in winter days? Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't. it's certainly
Well,
possible.
it's supposed to be for that purpose.
Yeah, I mean, most rocks, when they heat it up, will retain heat for a while and re-radiate them out. So I haven't heard of the use of granite for feet warmers, but I'm certainly sure it's possible. Soapstone seem to be preferred because it retains a lot of heat and radiates heat for a number of hours. And for anybody that's, I know we've covered, I'll get to in a moment.
Was there a lot of soapstone around here?
The outcrop over is just over the Andover, into the Andover. It's,
Because there was one I know that was out on Turnpike Street here. I don't know, if you don't live in North Andover, I could never describe it. But it's right near Boston Hill and Turnpike Street. There was a V in the road, and they always said that was a soapstone quarry.
I'll have to check on that. I haven't heard of that.
Well, I'm not saying I'm rude, but that's what I've always said.
Yeah, I'll ask around. I know a professional geologist is familiar with the area. If there is something there, she should know about it. You know, the one major soapstone deposit I'm familiar with in this area is at the Jenkins Quarry, and in front there's an outcrop that they were quarrying. The geologists from the 1800s estimated about 50 feet deep, maybe 50, 60 feet wide. The area over there is just littered with glacial erratics that broke off and were scattered all over the place. Soapstone does show up in a few other places here in Essex County, but it's really small deposits, either glacial boulders or a very narrow vein. We found a really narrow vein over in Byfield recently. They got exposed the house foundation in the 1800s, and they're actually having a lot of trouble trying to get it out of the way and gave up on it and just left it. Then we use the more common name soapstone. Soapstone is essentially a compacted talc material. And it comes in a number of different chemical configurations, range from anywhere from white to blue color. You kind of Jenkins quarry, and then Vermont is a greenish color. And it's all has to do with slightly different mineral compositions. It's a very fine-grained rock. The crystals are very, very compact and tight. Beyond that, I'd have to pull out the geology book and read you the more technical description, which pretty much goes over my head. Yes?
One last question. I've read over the years, probably on internet sites, about mention of mounds and stone chambers in this particular area, like the Andover area. Is that anything that you've heard about there?
We've not had the opportunity to extensively explore this area, so I'm not sure. As you go a few miles over into Georgetown, and there's quite a few there. Newbury and Byfield are just loaded with Native American sites. So it's very possible. I just haven't heard of it. And I don't know any researchers actively work in this area.
I think any time I've encountered a mention, it's always been on private property, but I figured I'd ask if you've heard of any of them.
Yeah, unfortunately, no. I mean, the estimates, somebody back in the 80s made an estimate that there were at least 100,000 Native American stone mounds in the greater New England area. And I've been talking with other researchers, we actually now think that's a conservative number based on, studies that have been done in just, certain towns and areas where they're coming up with, 500,000 cairns. And you start multiplying that by the number of towns out there, and you start coming up with some really large numbers. Where not all areas have Native American cairns, they tend to seem to come in pockets, and some various concentrations tend to be in major river valleys. That's also the area where the Native American population was concentrated. That's where the food supply was. So we're seeing a correlation between population density and density of these Native American sites.
So speak of mounds, you mean these stone?
Stone mounds, yeah, there's a number of names, depends on who you talk to, some people call them cairns. I have some other researchers that like to call them rock piles. Some people call them stone mounds, stone, you go through historic documents and sometimes call them stone heaps. So there's a lot of terms for them. People have their particular reason, preference. Some people don't like to use the word cairns because it's Scottish and it's it doesn't originate here in the U.S. But I know we covered a lot of territory tonight, and most of the materials we talked about are in our books. And the society actually just purchased a whole set of them, so you can come down here and read them. And I certainly encourage you to make use of the wonderful resources they have here. Been in contact with the archivist here, who's been helping me out getting information on the Jenkins Court for the tour. And it's just a really wonderful resource we have here.
And we also have a website.
Yes.
Which is?
Stonestructures.org. We have a few business cards with us, but if you just type in stone structures in Google, you'll find us. We cover the quarry, we cover the historic structures, we cover the Native American stuff. A couple of tours, self-guided tours you can do, we have on the website. And if you ever run into anything out in the woods that looks strange, you just can't make heads and tails up, email us. We get back to people in a couple of days. And we'll try our hardest to figure out what it is you found. Thanks for coming.